If you walked through the corridors of the National Convention in Paris in 1793, amidst the shouting, the sweat, and the smell of fear, your eyes would eventually rest on a young man who seemed not to belong there. He was strikingly handsome. Yet behind this calm, poet-like exterior stood Louis Antoine de Saint-Just, known to history as the Archangel of Terror. As Robespierre's right hand and the cold architect of the guillotine, he chilled the very air with his infamous declaration that the ship of revolution could only arrive safely on a sea red with blood. How did a lovesick boy who once wrote erotic poetry transform into the Republic's coldest executioner, willing to kill anyone to build his perfect world? His 26-year life is a terrifying tragedy where extreme idealism swallowed humanity whole. Today we step into the darkest shadows of the French Revolution to unravel the story of its most mysterious and contradictory figure, a tale of innocence turning into absolute terror. The story of the terror begins not in Paris but in the sleepy, sun-drenched town of Decize in the Nivernais province of central France. Louis Antoine Léon de Saint-Just was born here on a hot August day in 1767. From birth, Louis Antoine occupied a strange liminal space in French society that would define his future resentments. He was neither a peasant starving in the fields nor a true aristocrat of the high court. His father, Louis-Jean de Saint-Just de Richebourg, was a rough-hardened cavalry officer who had earned his nobility through blood and service rather than ancient lineage. His mother, Marie-Anne Robineau, came from a wealthy family of notaries. They were the bourgeoisie, respectable, moneyed, but looked down upon by the true dukes and counts of Versailles. Tragedy struck the household early. When Louis Antoine was just 10 years old, his father died. The strong, masculine figure of authority vanished from his life, leaving him as the sole surviving son. 2 younger sisters would follow, of a grieving widow. Madame de Saint-Just did what many grieving mothers do. She poured all her love, her anxiety, and her ambition into her golden-haired boy. She doted on him. She spoiled him. In her eyes, Louis could do no wrong. He grew up in a household where his word was law, where his whims were catered to. He learned early on that he was special, that he was superior, and that the world owed him its attention. The family moved to Blérancourt, a small village in Picardy. It was here, surrounded by the flat, open plains of northern France, that the young Saint-Just began to form his view of the world. But a brilliant mind needs a challenge, and his mother sent him away to the Oratorian College in Soissons for his education. The archives of the college paint a vivid, almost prophetic picture of the teenager. The priests who taught him were baffled. They described a boy of terrifying intelligence, capable of memorizing vast tracts of Latin and history, but they also described a nightmare. Described as turbulent and arrogant, Louis Antoine harbored a pathological hatred for discipline. Whenever a teacher attempted to correct him, he would simply stare them down with those cold blue-gray eyes until they looked away. Refusing to be subordinate, he walked the halls of the school, not like a student, but like a visiting prince inspecting his subjects. He was the smartest boy in the room, and he treated everyone else, teachers and students alike, with a quiet, sneering contempt. He was reading voraciously, but he wasn't just reading the classics. He was reading the dangerous new ideas filtering in from Paris. He read Rousseau. He read about the social contract. He read about a world where virtue, not birthright, determined a man's worth. For a boy who felt superior to everyone but lacked the high title to prove it, these words were intoxicating. But politics was not yet his passion. Like many young men of 19, his world was about to be shattered not by a revolution, but by a girl. The year was 1786. Saint-Just was 19 years old. He had returned to Blérancourt, a handsome, brooding young man with a head full of poetry and a heart waiting to be broken. He found the object of his affection in Thérèse Gelée. Thérèse was the daughter of the local notary, Antoine Gelée. She was beautiful, she was local, and by all accounts she returned the intense affections of the young Saint-Just. It was a passionate, youthful romance, the kind of first love that feels like it will last forever, the kind that consumes your every waking thought. They walked together in the fields of Picardy. They likely exchanged letters, promising eternity. For a brief moment, the angel of death was just a boy in love, but this was the Ancien Régime. In 1786, love mattered far less than alliances, dowries, and social standing. Thérèse's father, Antoine Gelée, was a pragmatic man. He looked at Saint-Just and saw a turbulent, unemployed widow's son with a bad reputation and an arrogant streak. Then he looked at François Taurin, a man from a prominent, wealthy, and established local family. The choice, to the father, was obvious. On July 25, 1786, without warning, Thérèse was married off to François Taurin. The shock to Saint-Just was cataclysmic. He wasn't just rejected, he was discarded. The marriage happened so fast that it felt like a tactical strike. He had been powerless. All his intelligence, all his beauty, all his arrogant belief in his own destiny meant nothing against the rigid, unfeeling walls of the social hierarchy. A wealthy father had snapped his fingers, and Saint-Just's happiness had been extinguished. He saw Thérèse, his Thérèse, walking down the aisle with a dull, uninspiring man chosen solely for his money and status. This moment is the psychological key to understanding the terror. Saint-Just felt humiliated. And for a narcissist, which he undoubtedly was, humiliation is a fuel that burns hotter than fire. He didn't just hate Thérèse's father. He began to hate the system that allowed fathers to sell their daughters like cattle. He began to hate the institution of marriage. He began to hate the wealthy bourgeoisie who thought they could buy anything. The personal grievance was beginning to curdle into a political philosophy. But before he became a revolutionary, he acted like a petulant, heartbroken teenager. He decided to burn his bridges. In September 1786, weeks after the wedding, Saint-Just snapped. He couldn't stand the sight of Blérancourt. He couldn't stand seeing Thérèse walking on the arm of another man. He needed to escape. He needed Paris. But Paris required money, and Saint-Just had none. One night while his mother slept, the 19-year-old Louis Antoine crept through his childhood home. He wasn't looking for food. He went to his mother's collection of valuables. He took silver bowls. He took cups. He took her jewelry. He gathered up the family silver, the symbol of his mother's bourgeois pride, and shoved it into a sack. Before the sun rose, he was gone. He boarded a coach for Paris carrying the stolen inheritance of his widowed mother. When he arrived in Paris, he sold the silver for a fraction of its worth, and then he lived. For a few glorious, delirious weeks, he lived the life of a libertine. He stayed in hotels near the Palais Royal, the epicenter of vice, gambling, and radical thought. He spent the money on prostitutes, on theater, on fine clothes. He was trying to drown the memory of Thérèse in the excess of the city, but the high life of a thief is short. His mother, Madame de Saint-Just, was not a woman to be trifled with. Discovering the theft and her son's disappearance, she was furious. But she was also terrified for him. In the 18th century, a young man loose in Paris could end up dead or conscripted into a foreign army within days. She took a step that seems shockingly harsh to modern eyes, but was a standard tool of parenting for the upper classes of the time. She appealed to the authorities for a lettre de cachet, A lettre de cachet was a royal order signed by the king or his ministers that allowed for imprisonment without trial. It was a tool of absolute monarchy, a way for families to discipline wayward sons or for the king to silence critics. The police tracked Saint-Just down in Paris. He was arrested, dragged from his bohemian fantasy, and thrown into a carriage. He wasn't going home. He was going to a place that would change him forever. The destination was the Maison de Saint-Colombe, a gloomy reformatory in the Rue de Picpus. It was a private prison, a place where embarrassing relatives were stashed away to think about their sins. For 6 months, from September 1786 to March 1787, Louis Antoine de Saint-Just was locked in this place. We must pause here and visualize this. He is 19 years old. He is proud, vain, and bursting with energy. And now, he is locked in a small room, staring at 4 gray walls. He has been stripped of his freedom, not by a court of law, but by his mother's signature and the king's seal. This confinement was the crucible. In the silence of that cell, the romantic boy died. A hardening process began. Day after day, he stewed in his own rage. He had time to think, he had time to analyze why he was there. Why was he in a cage? Because his mother had money and connections. Because the king had the power to lock anyone up without a trial. Because the world was arbitrary, cruel, and unjust. He began to see his personal suffering as a microcosm of France's suffering. I am in prison because of tyranny, he told himself. Thérèse is lost because of greed. The world is broken. During these long, lonely months, he wrote, but he didn't write political treatises, not yet. He wrote a poem, a long, sprawling, chaotic epic called Organt. If you were to read Organt expecting the high-minded rhetoric of the later revolutionary Saint-Just, you would be shocked. It is filthy. It is violent. It is pornographic. It is an explosion of teenage angst and bile. In the poem, he attacks everything. He attacks the church, depicting bishops and nuns in grotesque sexual scenarios. He attacks the nobility, portraying them as inbred idiots. But his most vicious venom is reserved for the queen, Marie Antoinette, and the king. He wrote lines that dripped with a desire for destruction. He fantasized about a world washed clean by fire. Organt was not great literature, but it was a psychological map. It showed a mind that had completely rejected the current order. He was no longer just a rebel, he was an iconoclast. He wanted to smash the idols. The boy who went into that prison was a heartbroken thief. The man who came out was a dangerous weapon, waiting for a war. In March 1787, his mother relented. The lettre de cachet was lifted. Saint-Just was released. He returned to Blérancourt, but he was unrecognizable. The turbulent, emotional shouting was gone. The happy-go-lucky air was vanished. In its place was a terrifying calm. He became a lawyer, studying the law with a cold, predatory focus. He walked the streets of his village with a new demeanor, stiff, upright, unapproachable. He began to dress with obsessive fastidiousness. If the world was chaotic, he would be perfect. If the world was dirty, he would be immaculate. He stopped socializing with his old friends. He seemed to be waiting for something. He was a coiled spring. And then, in July 1789, the news arrived from Paris. The people had stormed the Bastille. The fortress of tyranny had fallen. The king's power was broken. For the young lawyer in Blérancourt, it was as if the sun had finally risen. The chaos he had felt inside finally matched the chaos outside. The revolution had come. And Louis Antoine de Saint-Just knew, with the certainty of a fanatic, that this was what he had been born for. He threw himself into local politics. He joined the National Guard, rising rapidly to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He was a strict disciplinarian. He demanded absolute loyalty. He was rehearsing for the main stage, but he was still a nobody. He was a small-town lawyer in a small-town militia. He needed a way to project his voice to Paris. He needed a mentor. He needed a god to worship. He found him in the writings of a slight, bespectacled lawyer from Arras, a man named Maximilien Robespierre. In 1790, Saint-Just sat down and wrote a letter to Robespierre. It is one of the most fateful documents in the history of the Revolution. It was not a letter from a colleague, it was a letter from a disciple to a Messiah. He wrote, "You who support our tottering country against the torrent of despotism and intrigue, you whom I know as I know God only through his miracles." The connection was made. The spark had found the powder keg. Saint-Just was looking at the horizon, and he saw a sea of blood. And for the first time in years, he smiled. The time for poetry was over. The time for the guillotine was about to begin. That letter to Robespierre was the spark, but the fire would take 2 years to fully ignite. Saint-Just had found his God, but he still needed a pulpit. While he waited in the provinces, the revolution in Paris spiraled from hope into violence. The monarchy crumbled, the prisons filled, and the old world began to die. By the time Saint-Just finally arrived in the capital, the time for hero worship was over. He was no longer a fan writing letters from afar. He was now a player on the most dangerous stage in human history. September 1792. Paris was a city on the edge of the apocalypse. The monarchy had officially fallen in the insurrection of August 10th. The king, Louis XVI, was imprisoned in the Temple Tower. The Prussian army was marching toward Paris, threatening to burn the city to the ground. The streets were still slippery with the blood of the September massacres, where mobs had broken into prisons and butchered over 1,000 inmates in a frenzy of paranoia. Into this cauldron walked Louis Antoine de Saint-Just. He had just turned 25 years old, the absolute minimum legal age to serve as a deputy in the newly formed National Convention. He was the youngest man in the room. When he first entered the riding school, the manège, where the convention was held, nobody noticed him. He was a speck in a sea of giants. The convention was dominated by legendary figures. Danton, the bull-necked orator who could move crowds with a roar, Marat, the hideous skin-diseased journalist who called for heads from his bathtub, and Robespierre, the incorruptible, the moral center of the revolution. Saint-Just took his seat high up on the benches, in the section known as the Mountain, because the most radical deputies sat on the highest seats. For the first few weeks, he said nothing. He watched, he studied. He sat with the stillness of a predator, waiting for the herd to expose a weak flank. His colleagues saw a dandy. They saw his high cravats, his gold earrings, his perfectly powdered hair. They whispered that he was just another arrogant child playing at politics. A Girondin deputy, the moderate faction, famously dismissed him, saying, "He carries his head like the Holy Sacrament." Saint-Just heard the insult. He turned to his neighbor and whispered a retort that would become legend, "And I shall make him carry his like Saint Denis." Saint Denis was the patron saint of Paris, famously depicted carrying his own decapitated head. The young man was not playing. He was sharpening his blade. The convention was paralyzed by one massive looming question: what to do with Louis XVI? The king was deposed, but he was still alive. To the moderates, the Girondins, this was a legal nightmare. They wanted to follow the law. They argued that the king should be tried by a court with lawyers, witnesses, and due process. They cited the Constitution of 1791, which declared the king's person inviolable. They were terrified that executing the king would bring the wrath of all Europe down upon France. They wanted a compromise. They wanted to exile him or imprison him. They wanted to save his life to save their own consciences. Robespierre and the radicals knew the king had to die, but they were trapped in the Girondins' web of legal arguments. They were trying to find a legal loophole to kill a king who was technically protected by the law. The debate dragged on. The energy was draining out of the revolution. Then came November 13th, 1792. The president of the convention announced that the floor was open to the deputy from the Aisne. Saint-Just stood up. He walked to the podium. He was nervous. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged his papers. But when he looked up, his face was a mask of ice. The speech Saint-Just delivered that day is perhaps the most devastating piece of political logic in French history. It was his debut, and it destroyed the old world in under an hour. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms like Danton. He spoke in a flat, terrifyingly calm voice. He looked at the moderates and told them they were asking the wrong question. "You are looking for a law to judge the king," he said, "but there is no such law." He argued that a king is neither a citizen nor a neighbor. By his very nature, a monarch stands outside the social contract, not as a leader, but as a usurper and an enemy alien. Then he delivered the line that made the room gasp. "One cannot reign innocently. The folly of it is too evident. Every king is a rebel and a usurper." The brilliance of Saint-Just's argument was that he stripped away the complexity. He told the convention, if you try the king, you are admitting he might be innocent. If the king is innocent, then the revolution, which overthrew him, is a crime. If the king is innocent, then you are all rebels. For the king to live, Saint-Just concluded, the revolution must die. Therefore, the king must die. He wasn't asking for a verdict. He was asking for a kill. He framed the execution not as a legal act, but as an act of public safety, an act of war. This man must reign or die. When he stepped down from the podium, there was a stunned silence, followed by a thunderous ovation from the mountain. Robespierre was beaming. He had found his sword. The boy had outthought the best lawyers in France. He had made regicide seem not only necessary, but virtuous. From that day forward, the fate of Louis XVI was sealed. Saint-Just had cut the rope holding the blade. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was guillotined. As the king's head fell into the basket, Saint-Just did not look away. He believed he had just cleansed France of original sin. With the king dead, Saint-Just became a superstar of the Jacobin Club. He was elected to the Committee of Public Safety, the inner circle of 12 men who effectively ruled France as a collective dictatorship. His first major task was to write a constitution. It is one of the grim ironies of history that Saint-Just, the Archangel of Terror, helped write the most democratic constitution the world had ever seen. The Constitution of 1793 promised universal male suffrage, the right to education, the right to work, and even the right to insurrection. It was a beautiful document, filled with the light of the Enlightenment. Saint-Just presented it with pride. He truly believed in this utopia. He carried the draft in his pocket like a love letter to humanity. But the reality of 1793 was not a utopia. It was a nightmare. France was being invaded by England, Spain, Austria, and Prussia. Civil war was raging in the Vendée. The currency was collapsing. The Committee of Public Safety faced a choice: implement the democratic constitution and risk anarchy, or suspend rights to save the republic. Saint-Just, the man who loved liberty, was the one who stood up and strangled it. On October 10th, 1793, he appeared before the convention to deliver another thunderbolt. He declared that the Constitution was too dangerous to implement while the war lasted. The laws are revolutionary, he declared. The provisional government of France is revolutionary until the peace. In plain English, there will be no laws. There will be no elections. There will only be the will of the committee. He justified this with a terrifying metaphor. Those who make revolutions by halves, he said, do nothing but dig their own graves. You cannot be soft. You cannot be kind. You must be a sword. The Constitution was placed in a cedar box in the center of the convention hall. It was meant to be a holy relic waiting for peace. In reality, it was a coffin for liberty. By the end of 1793, the war was going badly. The army of the Rhine was in shambles. The soldiers were starving, the officers were corrupt, and the Austrians were winning. The committee decided to send their angel of death to the front lines. Saint-Just was appointed representative on mission to Alsace. This is where we see the full frightening competence of the man. He wasn't just a theorist who sat in Paris writing speeches. He was a man of action. He arrived in Strasbourg in October. The situation was desperate. The soldiers had no shoes, no coats, and no food. The aristocrats of the city were hoarding grain while the army starved. Saint-Just did not negotiate. He set up a portable guillotine in the town square. He looked at the corrupt army officers, generals who were incompetent or lazy. He had them arrested. He had them shot in front of their troops. He sent a message, victory or death. Then he turned his eyes to the wealthy of Strasbourg. He saw his soldiers walking barefoot in the snow, leaving bloody footprints. His rage was cold and absolute. He issued his famous proclamation, 10,000 soldiers are barefoot. You will take the shoes of all the aristocrats of Strasbourg, and you will deliver them to headquarters by tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. It was a brutal, totalitarian order. But the next morning, 10,000 pairs of shoes appeared. He seized grain. He seized coats. He taxed the rich into oblivion to feed the poor soldiers. To the common infantryman, Saint-Just was a hero, an avenging angel who punished the wicked officers and the greedy rich. To the bourgeoisie of Strasbourg, he was the devil incarnate. He worked 20 hours a day. He slept in his clothes. He led charges on horseback, his hat distinct with its tricolor plumes, risking his life alongside the men. And it worked. The discipline of the army was restored. The Austrians were pushed back. Saint-Just had saved the front, but the experience changed him. He had tasted absolute power. He had seen that terror worked. He had seen that a guillotine in the square made the grain arrive on time. He returned to Paris convinced that the only way to save France was to turn the entire country into an army camp. When Saint-Just returned to Paris in early 1794, the atmosphere had shifted. The external enemies were being beaten back, but the internal enemies, the factions, were tearing the revolution apart. There were two main threats to Robespierre's vision. On the one side were the Hebertists, the ultra-radicals. They wanted to de-Christianize France, burn churches, and kill more people faster. They were chaotic anarchists. On the other side were the Dantonists, led by Georges Danton. Danton was the lion of the revolution, the man who had rallied France in 1792. But Danton was tired. He had just remarried a young wife. He was sick of the blood. He started a newspaper calling for the Committee of Clemency. He wanted the terror to end. Robespierre saw both groups as fatal dangers. The Hebertists would lead to chaos. The Dantonists would lead to a return of the monarchy. Robespierre turned to Saint-Just. He needed his axe. First, they struck the Hebertists. Saint-Just delivered a report denouncing them as foreign agents. They were rounded up and guillotined in March 1794. The Paris mob was silenced. Then, the unthinkable happened. The committee turned its eyes toward Danton. Danton was a friend. He was a legend. To kill Danton was to kill the heart of the revolution. Robespierre hesitated. He was sick with anxiety. Saint-Just did not hesitate. He sat in his room surrounded by papers and began to draft the indictment against Danton. It was a work of pure fiction and rhetorical genius. He took Danton's friendships, his financial corruption, his desire for mercy, and twisted them all into a massive conspiracy. Danton, Saint-Just wrote, you are a bad citizen. You represent the parties of indulgence. You want to spare the enemies of the people. When the arrest warrant was signed, Danton laughed. They wouldn't dare, he roared. I will eat them like rats. But they did dare. The trial of Danton was a spectacle. Danton roared at the judges, appealing to the crowd. The trial was going badly for the committee. The people loved Danton. It looked like he might be acquitted. Saint-Just saw the danger. He didn't wait for the verdict. He ran to the convention, waving a letter he claimed proved a prison plot. He demanded a decree to silence the prisoners. They insult justice, Saint-Just shouted. We must silence them to save the country. The decree was passed. Danton's microphone was cut. The trial was rushed to a close. On April 5, 1794, Danton was carted to the scaffold. As he passed Robespierre's house, he shouted a curse. You will follow me. Your house will be razed to the ground, sowed with salt. Saint-Just watched Danton die. He had killed the most vibrant man in France to preserve the purity of the idea. With Danton gone, the last voice of opposition was silenced. The Committee of Public Safety had won. But this victory brought a strange and terrifying consequence. Saint-Just had believed that eliminating the traitors would bring about a golden age of virtue. Instead, as the spring of 1794 arrived, he found himself ruling over a city that wasn't cheering, but shivering. The noise of the debate was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence that would drive him deeper into his own dark ideology. It was the spring of 1794. The cherry blossoms were blooming in Paris, but the scent in the air was not of flowers, it was of stale blood. Georges Danton was dead. The Hébertists were dead. The king was dead. All the loud, messy human obstacles to the Republic of Virtue had been removed. The Committee of Public Safety now held absolute, unchallenged power over France. For Louis Antoine de Saint-Just, this should have been the moment of triumph. The factions were gone. The path to the perfect society was clear. But instead of triumph, a strange, suffocating silence descended upon the capital. Saint-Just felt it. In his private notes, he scribbled a phrase that haunts historians to this day. The revolution is frozen. He realized with a chilling clarity that the passion of 1789 was gone. The people were no longer marching with joy. They were marching with fear. The public squares were empty because everyone was afraid of being denounced. The general will had been replaced by the silence of the graveyard. Yet, Saint-Just did not stop. He believed that if the people were not virtuous enough for the Republic must force them to be virtuous. He began to retreat more and more into his own mind. He stopped dining out. He stopped seeing women. He lived like a monk, working 18 hours a day in the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by mountains of arrest warrants. He became a ghost in the machine of the terror. To understand why Saint-Just kept killing, we must look at what he was writing in secret during these final months. These writings, known as the Republican Institutions, were found in his papers after his death. They are a blueprint for a utopia that never happened. They reveal a mind that had completely departed from reality. Saint-Just didn't just want a new government, he wanted a new species of human being. He envisioned a France modeled on ancient Sparta. In his dream world, boys would be taken from their mothers at age 5 and raised by the state in harsh military schools. They would eat only vegetables and roots. They would sleep on mats. Gold and silver would be banned. Friendship would be mandatory. A man who had no friends would be banished. But a man who committed a crime and did not tell his friend would be banished, and the friend who didn't report him would be banished too. It was a terrifying vision of a totalitarian anthill. Everyone watched everyone. Everyone was poor. Everyone was virtuous. This was the tragedy of Saint-Just. He truly loved the people as an abstract concept, noble, pure, hard-working, but he despised actual people, the messy, greedy, fearful individuals he saw on the streets of Paris. He was willing to kill the actual people to save the imaginary people. As the summer heat rose in Paris, the paranoia of the committee reached a fever pitch. On May 22nd and 23rd, assassination attempts were made against Robespierre and Collot d'Herbois. The committee panicked. They believed they were surrounded by invisible assassins. On June 10, 1794, 22 Prairial, Georges Couthon, Robespierre's ally in the wheelchair, introduced a new law to the convention. It was drafted with the help of Saint-Just. The law of 22 Prairial was the legal mechanism of the Great Terror. It stripped away the last vestiges of justice. Prisoners were no longer allowed defense lawyers. Witnesses were no longer required. The jury did not need evidence. They only needed moral proof, a gut feeling. There were only two possible verdicts: acquittal or death. The rate of execution skyrocketed. The Red Mass had begun. The guillotine was moved to the Barrière du Trône to handle the volume. In just 6 weeks, over 1,300 people were beheaded in Paris alone. The gutters literally ran red. Saint-Just watched this carnage with a stoic face. To him, this wasn't murder. It was surgery. He was cutting out the gangrene to save the patient. But while Paris was drowning in blood, Saint-Just was called away again. The war on the northern frontier was critical. The Austrian army was massing near Charleroi. Saint-Just arrived at the front in June 1794. Once again, the dandy of Paris became the warrior of the Sambre. This was perhaps his finest hour. He didn't just purge generals this time, he led the strategy. He worked with General Jourdan to organize the assault. He was in the trenches, under fire, his hat pierced by a bullet. He rallied the troops not with threats, but with his own cold courage. On June 26, 1794, the French army met the Austrians at the Battle of Fleurus. It was a massive, chaotic engagement. At a critical moment, the French lines began to waver. Saint-Just rode to the front, sword in hand, and ordered the columns forward. The French won a decisive victory. The Austrians were crushed. The road to Belgium was open. France was saved. Saint-Just returned to Paris as a conquering hero. He was the organizer of victory. But here lies the cruelest irony of his life. His victory signed his death warrant. The entire justification for the terror was the emergency. The government needed dictatorial powers because foreign armies were at the gates. But after Fleurus, the foreign armies were gone. The emergency was over. The people of France looked at the guillotine chopping off heads by the dozen every day and asked, why? We have won the war. Why are we still dying? Saint-Just had saved the Republic, and in doing so, he had made himself obsolete. When Saint-Just returned to Paris in late June, he found the Committee of Public Safety in a state of civil war. The group was fracturing. On one side were the politicians, Belovarennes and Collot d'Herbois. They were brutal men, atheists, and pragmatists who hated Robespierre's moralizing. They felt Robespierre was acting like a pope, demanding everyone worship his supreme being. On the other side were the triumvirate, Robespierre, Saint-Just, and Couthon. Robespierre had stopped coming to the committee meetings. He was sick, exhausted, and sulking in his apartment. convinced that his colleagues were plotting against him. Saint-Just tried to be the peacemaker. It is a strange role for the angel of death, but records show he tried to bridge the gap. He met with Beloud and Collot. He told them, "We must stop eating each other." But it was too late. The fear was too deep. Beloud and Collot knew that if they didn't kill Robespierre, Robespierre would kill them. During a stormy meeting in the green room of the committee, Beloud shouted at Saint-Just, "You and Robespierre want to murder the whole convention." Saint-Just stared at him with his icy gaze and replied quietly, "If I thought you were a traitor, I would stab you myself." The lines were drawn. July 26, 1794, 8th at Thermidor. The air in Paris was heavy, humid, and oppressive. A storm was gathering over the city. Robespierre made a fatal mistake. He went to the convention and gave a long, rambling speech. He claimed there was a vast conspiracy against him. He threatened the deputies, but, and this was the error, he refused to name names. Every deputy in the hall thought, "He means me." That night, the Jacobin Club cheered Robespierre, but the deputies of the convention spent the night in terror. They moved from house to house whispering, organizing, forming a desperate alliance of survival. The far left and the far right united against the middle. Their slogan was simple: "Death to the tyrant." Meanwhile, in a small room near the Tuileries, Saint-Just was writing. He knew what was coming. He knew Robespierre had blundered. He knew the wolves were circling. He sat at his desk, dressed in his shirt sleeves. The window was open to the sultry night air. He was writing the speech he intended to give the next morning. It is a fascinating document. Unlike Robespierre's rant, Saint-Just's draft was calm, conciliatory. He intended to propose a compromise. He wanted to offer an olive branch to the convention. He wrote, "I belong to no faction. I will fight against them all." He worked through the night. At 5 a.m., the sun began to rise over Paris, a blood-red sunrise promising a scorching day. Saint-Just put down his pen. He dressed with his usual meticulous care. He put on his chamomile-colored coat, his white waistcoat, his pristine breeches. He tied his cravat high and tight. He looked in the mirror. He was 26 years old. He was the most feared man in France, and he was alone. He walked through the morning sun of July 27th, believing that his words still held the power of life and death. He believed that he could ascend the podium, speak his logic, and tame the beast of the convention one last time. But he did not see that the fear he had cultivated had finally curdled into hatred. As he crossed the threshold of the hall, the Archangel was not walking toward another political victory. He was stepping directly into a trap that had already been sprung. July 27, 1794, 9th Thermidor. The heat in Paris was suffocating. By noon, the temperature had soared to nearly 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The air inside the convention hall was unbreathable, a mix of sweat, bad perfume, and the electric tension of imminent violence. The deputies sat on their benches, fanning themselves, eyes darting around the room. Everyone knew that today was the day. The conspiracy Robespierre had ranted about the day before had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. During the night, the fear had galvanized the opposition. The right and the left, the corrupt and the fearful, had united against the triumvirate. At 12 p.m., Saint-Just entered the hall. He walked to the rostrum, the speaker's platform. He was calm. He was beautiful. His chamomile-colored coat was spotless. He laid his hat on the ledge, arranged his papers, and looked out at the sea of hostile faces. He began to speak. His voice was soft, reasonable. He intended to read the speech he had written the night before, the speech that offered a compromise. that denied he was part of any faction. "I am of no faction," he began. "I will fight against them all. The course of things has willed that this rostrum should be perhaps the Tarpeian rock, for him who tells you that the members of the government have left the path of wisdom." He got no further. Jean-Lambert Tallien, a corrupt deputy who knew he was on Robespierre's list, jumped up. He rudely interrupted the angel of death. "I ask that the curtain be torn away," Tallien screamed. Normally, the president of the convention would have silenced the interrupter, but today the president was Collot d'Herbois, Saint-Just's enemy. Collot rang his bell, not to silence Tallien, but to encourage him. The room erupted. Down with the tyrant! Down with the dictator! And then something extraordinary happened. Saint-Just, the man who had silenced Danton, the man whose voice had sent a king to the guillotine, the man who had dominated the convention for 2 years, said nothing. He did not fight back. He did not shout. He did not pound his fist. He stepped back from the podium, folded his arms, and leaned against the wood. A strange, small smile played on his lips. He watched the chaos unfold with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a colony of ants devour a beetle. Why was he silent? Historians have debated this for centuries. Was he shocked? Was he disdainful, refusing to dignify this mob with a response? Or did he, in that moment, realize that the idea was dead, and therefore he was already dead? He stood there for 4 hours. He stood there while Robespierre tried to speak and was shouted down. He stood there while they mocked him. He stood there like a marble statue in the middle of a riot. The chaos reached its peak around 4 p.m. A distinct cry went up from the back of the hall. "I demand the arrest of Robespierre." The dam broke. The motion was seconded. Then someone shouted, "And Saint-Just," and Couthon. The vote was unanimous. The Archangel of Terror was officially an outlaw. Ushers came to take them into custody. Robespierre was furious, his face purple with rage, his glasses sliding down his nose. But Saint-Just descended the steps of the rostrum with a terrifying, elegant slowness. He allowed himself to be led away without a word, but the drama was not over. The Paris Commune, the city government, was loyal to Robespierre. When they heard the news, they sounded the tocsin, the alarm bells. They called out the National Guard. They refused to accept the arrest. In a comedy of errors, the jailers refused to imprison Robespierre and Saint-Just because they were afraid of the Commune. By early evening, the arrested men were free. They were taken to the Hôtel de Ville City Hall. It was now nightfall. A heavy summer storm broke over Paris. Thunder rattled the windows of the Hôtel de Ville. Rain lashed the cobblestones. Inside the city hall, the leaders of the terror were gathered. They were free. They had troops. They had the terrifying Henriette commanding the artillery outside. They could have marched on the convention and slaughtered their enemies. Robespierre sat at a table paralyzed by indecision. He wanted to be legal. He didn't want to seize power by force. He wanted the people to give it to him. And Saint-Just? Witnesses describe him standing by the window watching the rain. He was silent. He seemed to know it was over. He saw the troops outside slowly melting away as the rain poured down, and no orders came. He watched the people, the entity he worshipped, abandon him. Around 2 a.m., the convention's troops, led by Paul Barras, broke into the Hôtel de Ville. The scene that followed was pure horror. Robespierre, realizing all was lost, tried to shoot himself. He fumbled the pistol. The shot didn't kill him. It shattered his jaw. He fell onto the table, blood pouring from his mouth. Lebas, a loyal friend, blew his brains out. Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian's brother, threw himself out the window and broke his legs. Couthon, the paraplegic, was shoved down a staircase, tumbling like a broken doll. Amidst this screaming blood and gunpowder smoke, only one man remained standing, Saint-Just. He had no weapon. He made no attempt to kill himself. He stood calmly in the center of the room waiting for the soldiers. When they rushed in, swords drawn, he simply held out his hands. He surrendered to death with the same cold logic with which he had lived. The Republic is gone, his silence seemed to say. There is no reason to stay. July 28th, 1794, 10th, Thermidor. The prisoners were dragged back to the Tuileries, to the anteroom of the Committee of Public Safety, the very room where they had ruled France just yesterday. It was a gruesome scene. Robespierre was lying on a table, his head wrapped in bloody bandages, groaning in agony. The others were moaning on the floor. Saint-Just stood apart. His coat was rumpled, but he was still upright. He looked around the room. His eyes landed on a sheet of parchment hanging on the wall. It was the Constitution of 1793, the document he had helped write, the promise of liberty, equality, and happiness that was currently locked in a cedar box. He walked over to it. He pointed a finger at the text. He looked at the soldiers guarding him and spoke his final recorded words. I am the one who made that. C'est pourtant moi qui ai fait cela. It was not a boast. It was an epitaph. It was a reminder that beneath the blood and the terror, there had been a dream. At 4 p.m., the executioners came. They cut his hair. They tore the collar of his shirt. They were loaded into carts. The journey to the guillotine took hours. The streets were packed. The crowd was hysterical with joy. They danced. They screamed insults. They threw mud. Robespierre was a wreck, half dead, eyes closed. But Saint-Just kept his eyes open. He stood at the front of the cart. He looked directly at the mob. He saw the women blowing kisses to the executioners. He saw the people cheering for the death of the man who had claimed to be their savior. He did not flinch. He did not look down. He maintained his insulting disdain to the very end. They arrived at the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde. The guillotine waited. One by one, his friends were beheaded. Couthon, Augustin, Henriette. When it was Saint-Just's turn, he climbed the steps without help. He did not speak to the crowd. He did not ask for God's forgiveness. He lay down on the plank. The wooden collar snapped shut. He was 26 years and 11 months old. The blade fell. The death of Saint-Just marked the end of the terror. The next day, the prisons were opened. The Republic of Virtue was replaced by a republic of corruption, parties, and excess. History has never known quite what to do with Louis Antoine de Saint-Just. While some see him as a monster, a cold-blooded fanatic who treated human lives like arithmetic, others view him as a tragic angel, consumed by a desire for justice so pure it burned everything in its path. He is the Rambo of politics, a shooting star that blazed too hot and destroyed everything in its orbit. Perhaps the truth lies in the paradox. He wanted to create a world where no one was unhappy, and to do it, he created a world where everyone was afraid. He wanted to banish tyranny, yet he became a tyrant. In the end, he remains the marble enigma of the French Revolution, a beautiful, terrible young man, frozen in time, pointing at a constitution on the wall and whispering to the future, I am the one who made that.